Today I'm going to be continuing my discussion of some of the significant events in the 1850s that contributed to the escalation of sectional tensions between North and South. I'm going to be focusing on the Supreme Court ruling of Dred Scott versus Sanford and the rise of Abraham Lincoln, and I'll finish it off with the John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. To begin with, let's take a look at the election of 1856. This is going to be the first presidential election where the newly formed Republican Party is going to run a candidate for president. And this election of 1856 takes place in the midst of this whole dispute over Kansas. That bleeding Kansas, the mini civil war that's taking place out in Kansas to determine which faction will dominate Kansas politics, the pro-slavery or anti-slavery factions. That's going on in the midst of this election of 1856. So this debate over slavery, particularly the spread of slavery into the frontier with Kansas as the focal point, that is going to be at the center of this election in 1856. Candidates will be unable to avoid this issue in terms of how it impacts the campaign. In fact, as it turns out, this election will take place along sectional lines. With voting, Northerners voting one way and Southerners voting another way in terms of their choice of candidate. It'll be very bitter, very fierce rivalries here in terms of each candidate's position on this issue. To begin with, the Democrats they're going to basically abandon Pierce because they kind of gotten frustrated with his handling of this situation. So they're not going to renominate him or for re-election. Again, a lot of the Democrats are angry over his support for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was a very divisive ordeal. Again, they're still right in the midst of that ordeal. So the Democrats are going to nominate James Buchanan as their candidate in this 56 election. They chose Buchanan because he was untouched by this Kansas-Nebraska ordeal. At the time, he was serving as America's ambassador to England, so he wasn't even in the country through most of this ordeal that had been happening in the previous couple of years. So Buchanan is kind of clean, so to speak. He hasn't really been touched or tainted by this ordeal. So he's not controversial, and again, he's kind of a safe bet. And in times like this, if your party wants to have a chance of winning, you need a candidate who is surrounded by the least amount of controversy, because the public hasn't really formed an opinion about this candidate because they've not really been connected with this issue in any direct way. So Buchanan is a safe bet for the Democrats. Both Northern and Southern Democrats can get behind Buchanan in terms of his representing the party. Even though he's from Pennsylvania, he's a Northerner. Southern Democrats can get behind him because he has not weighed in on this slavery issue yet, so he's less controversial. The Republican Party, however, having recently been formed as an opposition party to or a protest of this Kansas-Nebraska Act, they're going to have a little bit harder time finding a candidate that's going to have wide appeal. Again, the Republican Party has taken a very strong stance against slavery in the territories, against the spread of slavery. Just as a reminder, the Republican Party is not focusing on abolishing slavery. They are focusing on preventing slavery from spreading into the territory. So there's a difference there. Even though a lot of abolitionists support the Republican Party at this time. Republicans are going to choose John C. Fremont, and this is an old Whig strategy, nominating a war hero in hopes that their popularity as a war hero will win them a wide appeal across the nation. John C. Fremont was one of the key figures in the Mexican War. He led the campaign out in California. So Fremont, a war hero, war veteran, again has wide appeal, or the Whigs are hoping that he'll have wide appeal at, well, the Republicans using an old Whig tactic, the war hero angle. However, their strong stance against the spread of slavery is going to make the Republicans have a very narrow appeal. No Southerners are going to vote for this Republican candidate. In fact, you can kind of figure that out just from the Republican slogan during this campaign: free soil, free speech, and Fremont. This kind of sums up the Republican campaign agenda here. They are the party of freedom, specifically freedom from slavery on the frontier. So for obvious reasons, they're not going to have any appeal outside of the North. In fact, even within the North, their appeal is somewhat limited because Buchanan has a lot of appeal among Northern Democrats. So not all Northerners are going to vote for the Republicans here. So the way this campaign plays out is that this issue of slavery becomes foremost in the debate. Very bitter, very divisive in terms of how the parties are attacking each other. At one point, Democrats Democrats already viewed the Republican Party as an enemy of slavery, and for obvious reasons. But Southerners threatened secession if Fremont was elected president. They come right out and say it. If Fremont is elected, if a Republican is elected president, that's it. We're done. We will leave the Union. So the Southerners are kind of upping their threats. They're bringing up this old secession threat again if a Republican is elected president in '56. Some Southern leaders declare that Fremont's election would be the equivalent of a declaration of war against the South. And of course, this is one of the reasons why they threatened to secede. It'll be the end of the Union. If this nation elects a Republican president, we will quit the Union, and that is it. So these threats are becoming more belligerent, more passionate. They're not just idle talk in the back halls of Congress. They're coming right out and declaring it in '56 that they will secede if Fremont is elected. Republicans, of course, will respond to this in the course of these debates. Republicans will accuse the Democrats of being accomplices in a conspiracy to spread slavery throughout the nation. And so that's what they want all along. If you elect the Democrats, you are voting to spread slavery everywhere. So you can see just by some of the arguments that the parties are making that this issue of slavery has become very divisive in the nation. And now we already kind of see some red flags here in terms of where this is all heading. Keep in mind, in '56, we're still about 5 years away from the Civil War at this point, but we're close enough to where some of these threats are starting to sound more real. So, the threats of the South to secede are starting to sound a little bit more believable given the level of anger and frustration on both sides. Well, Fremont will win. Fremont will not win this election. James Buchanan will be elected president in '56, and he'll serve his one term there. When we look at how the campaign played out, how the election played out, we see, and this I haven't really showed you a lot of campaign maps or election maps for every election because a lot of them are just they don't really indicate anything really obvious. But in '56, we can see some obvious patterns starting to form here. Looking at how just the way each individual state voted is very suggestive of how divided the nation is in 1856. Typically, when you look at an election map today, as far as which states voted for which candidate, it looks like a checkerboard. There's Republican here, Democrat there, Republican here, Democrat there. It's all kind of spread out and mixed up. In 1856, however, we see a very distinct line across the nation dividing Republican votes as opposed to Democrat votes. And of course, here we see another obvious stark factor here is that not one single Southern state voted for a Republican candidate. Again, highlighting how the Republican Party is a sectional party. They only have appeal in the North. And you see, even in '56, despite the Republicans making a good showing here, several northern states, Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, all these northern states voted for Buchanan. So the Democratic Party still has a lot of influence in the North. And this is why Buchanan is going to win. Any candidate that can have a wide appeal that stretches across the nation from one section to another, that candidate has the best chance of winning. A candidate that has a very narrow appeal to just a limited part of the country, no matter how strong his support is in that area, if he doesn't appeal outside that area, he's not going to win. And that's what happens here in 1856. And we see the this divided this stark border between Democrat and Republican here in this 56 election as an indication of how divided the nation is over this issue of slavery. So so Buchanan will win. It's not a landslide, but it's not a close race either. If Fremont carried 11 of the northern states, if he had won 2 more of the northern states, just based on the electoral college votes, he probably would have won the election. So it's not a close race, but it's not a landslide either. But Buchanan is a clear winner, and this, a lot of people kind of breathe a sigh of relief here when, especially in light of the Southern threats to secede if Fremont was elected. When Fremont lost, a lot of people are like, okay, we barely avoided a potential civil war here. Maybe it's a good thing that the Republicans didn't win because the South might have followed through on their threat. So a lot of people kind of breathe a sigh of relief when Buchanan is elected, not because they necessarily love Buchanan, but they were glad to have not put the South in a situation where they would be following through on their threat. So when Buchanan gives his inauguration speech in 57, this is the spring of 57, Buchanan declares, publicly, openly, that the major objective of his administration is to bring an end to this sectional debate, this North versus South debate over slavery. Buchanan comes right out and says, it is my goal as president to finally bring an end once and for all to this divisive issue of slavery. And of course, he's not real specific or clear on what exactly he's going to do to bring about the end of this debate, but he makes it clear that that's his objective. What he does do is he says that, this is still within his inauguration speech, he indicates that within a couple of days, the Supreme Court is going to hand down a ruling which will once and for all settle this issue of slavery in the territories. As said, there won't be any cause for debate afterwards because the Supreme Court ruling will be definitive and it will settle this issue once and for all. So we can all just kind of get back to life as normal and not have to debate this topic anymore. The Supreme Court, of course, is the final word. The case that he was referring to is, of course, this Dred Scott versus Sanford, which will be, the ruling will be handed down in March of 57, just a few days after Buchanan's inauguration speech. Now, while the ruling was handed down in March of 57, the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford actually begins about 10 years earlier out in Missouri. Dred Scott was a slave whose master was an army officer, an army surgeon, doctor. And in the course of his duties, this army doctor, Sanford is his name, traveled extensively throughout Wisconsin Territory and the state of Illinois, both of which are, Illinois is a free state and Wisconsin's territory is free territory by virtue of the Missouri Compromise. So Sanford, this army officer, this doctor who was stationed in Missouri, traveling extensively in free territory, free states. Of course, Scott accompanied him on this this tour of duty. Now, Sanford dies, and then this is in 1846. After Sanford died, Scott is going to sue Sanford's widow for his freedom. And his argument will be that he's got a lot of help from some abolitionist lawyers who will step up to help him fight this case. So Scott and his lawyers argue that the time that he spent traveling in free territory during those 4 or 5 years that Sanford had traveled there, his presence in free territory erased his status as a slave. The fact that he was living for so long in free territory entitled him now to his freedom. So he's suing Sanford's widow for his freedom, and this is his argument. He said, I was in free territory, Wisconsin, which by virtue of the Missouri Compromise was officially free territory. So since I spent so long in free territory, I should be entitled to my freedom. This is the basis of his argument. Well, the case is presented before the Missouri state courts, and they all rule against Scott in this case. It eventually, again, this is through the help of some abolitionist lawyers, it eventually arrives in the Supreme Court. And we're now in the spring of 1857. So Scott's case against his owner's or his master's widow has now arrived at the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, if you remember, Taney was appointed to the Supreme Court by Andrew Jackson. So he's been there for a while. Taney is going to hand down a ruling in this case. He'll be ruling against Scott. So Scott will not win his freedom in this case. But in this ruling is going to have two very important aspects to it. And this is going to be a very controversial ruling. In fact, it'll have just the opposite effect. Buchanan said that this ruling is going to settle the debate once and for all. It actually does just the opposite. It escalates it and makes it even more intense. What Taney and the Supreme Court rule in this case is that first and foremost, Scott had no right to sue in a federal court because neither slaves nor free blacks are considered U.S. citizens. So if they're not U.S. citizens, they don't have the right to sue anybody in court. So Taney says, first and foremost, Scott should never have been in court in the first place because he has no rights. He's not a U.S. citizen. The second part of this ruling, and this is where it gets really controversial. The second part of this ruling, Taney states that even if Scott did have rights as a citizen, his whole argument is based on a law that's unconstitutional. And of course, Taney is referring to the Missouri Compromise here. Remember, Scott had argued that since he spent so long in free territory defined by the Missouri Compromise, that he was entitled to his freedom. Taney says no. The Missouri Compromise, which designated the Wisconsin territory as free territory, that was unconstitutional. Basically, the whole Missouri Compromise, which prohibited slavery in those territories north of 3630 latitude, the federal government had no authorization, no right to make such a law because it violated the Fifth Amendment rights of slave owners. Basically it deprived them of their constitutional right to private property. And of course, their property they're referring to here is slaves. So Taney says the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Congress had no right to declare that territory as free territory. So Scott's argument about using the Missouri Compromise as the basis for his freedom is flawed. It's unconstitutional. So again, to kind of recap here, first and foremost, Scott has no rights. He's not a citizen. Slaves and free blacks don't have any rights. They're not U.S. citizens. Second part, the Missouri Compromise, which made that Wisconsin territory free, this was unconstitutional. So these are the two parts of Taney's ruling in Dred Scott versus Sanford, and this sets off a firestorm of controversy. It doesn't settle the issue at all. One of the reasons that people get so upset about this is that in effect, Taney has ruled that Congress doesn't have the power to prohibit slavery anywhere. The fact that Congress tried to prohibit slavery is unconstitutional. It's a violation of Fifth Amendment rights. So if that's true, in essence, basically the Supreme Court is saying that slavery could be legal everywhere. Nobody has the authority to prohibit slavery. When Taney was ruling the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, he also went on to say that the idea of popular sovereignty was also unconstitutional because no government, be it the federal government or a territorial government or even a state government, has the right to deprive citizens of their private property or to prohibit slavery. So basically, while he didn't come right out and say it, Taney has declared that slavery is potentially legal everywhere in America. And this is why people in the North are so concerned. Those states that have already abolished slavery, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, all these states that have abolished slavery, they're all very nervous now. They say, okay, what if slave owners move into Pennsylvania and they want to bring their slaves with them. Slavery is illegal in Pennsylvania, but if that slave owner tries to sue the state of Pennsylvania, and of course we're just speaking hypothetically here, then the court could cite this Dred Scott versus Sanford case as a precedent to overturn a state's prohibition on slavery. So this is an important decision here, because it now suggests that that slavery could potentially spread all across the nation, and legally no one could do anything about it. This is going to be again, this is going to be a further intensification of this debate. It's not going to settle it. It's not going to calm things down. It's going to escalate things dramatically. A lot of Northerners, for example, Abraham Lincoln, who we haven't really gotten to know yet. Abraham Lincoln is about to come into the picture here as a key player in this debate because of this Dred Scott ruling. At this point in '57, Lincoln is retired from politics. He served briefly as a U.S. congressman from Illinois way back several years ago. But at this point, he's retired from politics. He's a lawyer in Illinois. But this Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling, it strikes a chord with Lincoln. And it inspires him to come back into politics, to get involved for the specific reason of fighting against this issue of slavery. So again, a lot of the Northerners, again, Abraham Lincoln being one of them, saw this Dred Scott ruling as basically evidence of a slave power conspiracy. What the Republicans have been accusing the Democrats of for so long, that this is the Southerners have gotten their hooks into the federal government, and the federal government is basically a pawn of Southern interests, and those interests being to spread slavery everywhere in the country. And a lot of people point at this Dred Scott case as evidence of that conspiracy. So at any rate, this is going to be enough to draw Abraham Lincoln out of retirement and to become re-involved in politics, specifically in order to fight against the spread of slavery. So let's talk a little bit about Lincoln now. Since this Dred Scott case has inspired Abraham Lincoln to re-engage in politics, let's talk a little bit about some other factors that are going to come into play here. Give a little bit of biographical background on Lincoln here. Again, we haven't done this with every president, but there's a few that have played a major role in the development of our story of early U.S. history, and they are worth taking a little bit closer look at. So Lincoln, born in Kentucky in 1809. So he's from the frontier. He spent most of his life in Illinois. His family moved to Illinois when he was young. Had very little formal schooling. He was smart though, and he liked to read. So he became self-educated. He's pretty ambitious. So he's a self-educated man. Worked as a clerk for a while in a general store in Springfield. He served briefly in the Illinois state legislature, and again as a U.S. Congressman representing the state of Illinois. But after only one term in Congress, Lincoln decided that he was through with politics, and of course he was serving in Congress during the Mexican War in the 1840s. So he retires from politics. He decides that he's had enough. He's not interested in politics anymore. So he moves back to Illinois, and there he becomes a lawyer, and he opens a practice, and that's where he is in 1857. So when he decides to get re-involved in politics, what he does, the opportunity he uses is, it just so happened to be a convenient moment here. Stephen Douglas, also from Illinois, the U.S. Senator from Illinois, Douglas's seat in the U.S. Senate is coming up for re-election. So Douglas's current term is ending in '58, and he's going to have to be re-elected. So what Lincoln and the Republicans, Lincoln joins the Republican Party, and the Republicans you back him in a campaign against Douglas for this Illinois Senate seat. Now, here's the thing. Normally, a campaign within a state for the Senate, a Senate campaign, would not attract the attention of the nation. Nobody outside of Illinois would really care about this normally. But the fact that it's Stephen Douglas, who we're talking about here, this debate is going to gain a lot of national attention. Stephen Douglas is a celebrity. Remember, he's the one that saved the Compromise of 1850. The whole Kansas-Nebraska Act was Douglas's idea. Douglas is known nationwide. Everybody in the nation knows who Stephen Douglas is. Nobody really knows who Lincoln is. Outside of Illinois, nobody's ever heard of him. But everybody knows who Stephen Douglas is. So when Lincoln, as a Republican, challenges Douglas's seat in the U.S. Senate, the eyes of the nation turn to Illinois, and everybody's watching to see what happens. So this is going to be a high-profile, highly publicized debate between Lincoln and Douglas for this Illinois seat in the U.S. Congress. Now, basically, when Lincoln accepts this Republican nomination for this Illinois Senate seat, he gives a speech, kind of an acceptance speech, and this kind of defines Lincoln's position on this issue of slavery. And so basically, as soon as he takes the stand, as soon as he enters this race, he makes it very clear what his position on slavery is. It's his famous House Divided speech. You can look it up online and find the complete transcript of the speech. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but there's a couple of lines that really bear quoting in this particular instance. Basically, Lincoln comes right out and says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He said the Union will not endure permanently half slave and half free. Basically, what Lincoln is saying here, of course, he's using this house as a metaphor, and it's a biblical reference. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The house, of course, is the nation, the Union. The Union is not going to survive as long as it's divided between pro-slave and anti-slave. This division, this tension is going to eventually tear the house down, tear the nation down. Eventually, at some point, we'll have to be faced with: are we going to allow slavery to exist, or are we going to abolish it? Those are the only two choices. It's either going to be slavery or no slavery. Lincoln says we cannot continue permanently having both in the same country. So he comes right out and says, this is where we're going. We're either going to get rid of it or we're going to embrace it. We can't have both. The nation will not survive. So Lincoln, now in order to gain some attention for his campaign, challenges Douglas to a series of debates, a series of 7 debates that will take place in the summer of 58, where Lincoln and Douglas will travel around within the state of Illinois, speaking to various crowds of people, competing for this Illinois Senate seat in the U.S. Congress. So in these speeches, of course, we'll take a look here at the here's, of course, a photograph of Lincoln and Douglas. Now, this photo is they were never photographed together. This photo is a composite. Someone has merged 2 separate photos here. But this photo is also kind of misleading in that Lincoln and Douglas both appear to be about the same height, when exactly the very opposite is true. Lincoln was very tall, well over 6 feet, and Douglas was a very short man, barely 5 feet. So, and of course, here of course is Lincoln and Douglas, an artist's illustration of Lincoln and Douglas debating at one of these speeches in Illinois. And of course, these debates take place over a period of about 4 months in the summer of 58. Seven different debates in 7 different places. Crowds of up to about 15,000 people will gather. Most of them, of course, coming to hear what Douglas has to say. Keep in mind, Douglas is very popular in the state of Illinois. He's very well liked. The people there love him. And they're all curious to see who is this Abraham Lincoln and what makes him think he can challenge our hero, Stephen Douglas. Well, this is the main purpose of these debates, of course, is Lincoln is trying to introduce himself to the people of Illinois, trying to get his voice heard, and of course to reshape this debate over slavery. And Lincoln uses these 7 debates as a platform for his perspective on slavery, and he speaks very often in these speeches about his position on slavery. And basically, it's not just basically talking about what he's going to do for Illinois as their U.S. senator. He's talking about this issue of slavery. So he's kind of using this as a forum for this debate on slavery. And he often frames this debate in starkly contrasting terms. In fact, in one of his speeches, basically Lincoln really starts to push the moral angle on slavery here. He basically comes out and says that the real controversy here, the real issue in this debate over slavery is right versus wrong. He said some people in this nation have decided that slavery is wrong. Others look at slavery and they don't see it as anything wrong. So basically what ends up here is that Lincoln has reframed the language of this debate. He's put it in terms of right versus wrong, good versus evil, and this has an effect. Up until this point, a lot of the arguments made in this debate over slavery are political, economic, constitutional arguments. As far as debating violation of civil rights and so forth. Of course, the abolitionists have long argued the moral implications of slavery, but Lincoln here he's whittling it down to its most basic form: right versus wrong. You're either for right or you're for wrong. You support the right or you support the wrong. You're good or evil. And when you frame it in these starkly contrasting terms, it kind of takes away a lot of the gray area. A lot of people have over the course of this debate have found space in the middle somewhere. So, well, I'm opposed to slavery, but I don't really own slaves, but I think slavery is okay. A lot of people have kind of placed themselves in the middle of this debate. Lincoln says, no, you either support good or you support evil. And this takes a lot of the gray area out. People now start thinking in terms of good versus evil, and this kind of escalates the debate to a moral crusade, if you will. So what ends up happening in the course of these debates, while Lincoln does gain some notoriety here and he does give a voice to this debate, he just doesn't have the credibility to defeat Douglas. Douglas is so well known and so popular in the state of Illinois. There's no way Lincoln never had a chance of beating Douglas. So Douglas will win this. He will win, or he will retain his seat in the U.S. Senate from Illinois, and Lincoln will lose, and he will just kind of go on about his business. But what ends up happening is the reason why we talk about this debate in terms of our larger story here is that it's these debates that gain Lincoln national notoriety. Since all the national press was here focused on what's going on with Douglas, they were also focused on what's going on with Lincoln. The national press is like, who is this guy Lincoln? We've never heard of him before. Well, now they've heard of him. So in all the newspapers, you're reading about Douglas, you're also reading about Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln now gains a lot of national notoriety. And it's because of his performance in these debates that the Republican Party is going to see Lincoln as their best chance for victory in 1860, the 1860 presidential election that's coming up here in a couple of years. Lincoln impresses the Republicans so much that they decide, okay, this is our guy. Lincoln is our guy to carry us to the White House in 1860. So even though Lincoln loses this debate with Douglas in Illinois, it positions him well to move on to the next level in 1860. So the following year, 1859, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are kind of old news at this point. Everything's kind of just ongoing. Everybody's business as usual. The debate for over slavery still rages every day in the press and in Congress. Our old friend John Brown from Kansas is going to come onto the scene again in 1859. And I've entitled this slide here "The Beginning of the End," and it's really the best way to describe this. 1859. We know we're only about a year or so away from the Civil War at this point. So a lot of the stuff going on in 1859 is kind of leading into, it's kind of a segue into the Civil War, especially. And this John Brown's raid is of particular importance here, because this is going to serve as a major catalyst in this divisive issue over slavery, North versus South. John Brown did not cause North and South to hate each other, but John Brown's raid in '59, it dramatically speeds up this process of division between North and South, and it becomes, for many people, this is kind of the last straw, and a lot of people decide at this point that, okay, you know what, that's it. It's just a matter of time before this whole thing blows up into a war. So you wouldn't think that one man could play such an influential role in this story, but John Brown is one of those people. He just, in terms of history, he was there at the right place, the right time, and his actions are going to have a dramatic impact on this story. So to begin with, John Brown, at this point in '59, he's got this big plan of starting a massive slave uprising and spreading it through the South. And to get this thing started, he's going to attack a federal arsenal at a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, it's not a big town. Looking at the map here, Harper's Ferry is a kind of a small town in northern Virginia, but it's right on the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac River. And of course, there's the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad runs right through Harper's Ferry. So it's not a big town, but it's an important town because of these three major transportation routes here. The federal government has located an arsenal at this location, and there were federal arsenals all over the country. Think of a federal arsenal as kind of like a National Guard armory. You keep in mind our primary defense is militia in this period of history. So an arsenal functions as kind of a rally point for the militia. If the militia are ever called up in time of emergency, they will rally at the arsenal. They'll draw ammunition and supplies, which are stored at these arsenals. And from there they will launch whatever campaign that is necessary. So these arsenals are located all throughout the country, and they stockpile weapons and ammunition here for the purpose of war in case militia is ever called up. So John Brown has targeted this arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and he's going to use this as kind of a staging point for his giant slave uprising that's going to sweep through the South. So what will happen here now is that on the night of October 16th, John Brown and about 22 of his followers, some of his sons, and of course some of their friends, and just kind of a small group of radicals that were like-minded. They felt, as John Brown did, that it was their personal responsibility to destroy slavery, and to keep in mind, these people. Today we probably would refer to these people as terrorists because they are operating outside the law. They are determined to achieve their objective through violent means, and not to try and excuse Brown and his comrades here, but we try to understand why they've done something like this. Brown is frustrated. He's been an abolitionist most of his adult life, as are all of his friends. They have fought against this institution of slavery for years and years, and they've made no progress. The federal government is no closer now to abolishing slavery than they were 30 years ago. So Brown is very frustrated. He's very angry, and the fact that he like so many other abolitionists thinks slavery is a sin. It's an evil. It's an abomination. They figure it's their moral duty to destroy this institution, since the federal government seems to be helpless to do so. So on the night of October 16th, Brown and his 22 followers, they sneak into Harper's Ferry. and they seized control of the arsenal, which was located at there was on the arsenal property. There's an engine house, a fire engine house, just where they kept a fire engine for the local fire volunteers, whatever. That's kind of where they're holed up now. It was very easy, in fact, for them to seize this arsenal. As it turns out, there was only a couple of night watchmen on guard here, so no one really suspected that somebody would try something like this, so there's not a lot of security measures in place. So it's very easy for Brown and his men to seize control of this arsenal. Once they do that, though, here's where Brown's plan kind of falls apart. Brown is not a military leader. He's not a strategist. He's not a tactician. He's just a man with an idea and that a lot of people agree with. So he wants to start this slave uprising. He knows there's weapons here, and he figures he'll seize the arsenal and then distribute these weapons to the local slaves and use that as the basis for his army. And he'll just continue on from town to town in that manner, liberating and arming slaves along the way until the entire South has been liberated. Well, he has no specific plan on how to do this other than get the weapons and free the slaves. That's basically his whole plan. Once he seizes control of the arsenal here at Harper's Ferry, he sends out his scouts. Okay, go out and round up all the slaves in the area, bring them back here, and we'll hand out weapons and we'll get our revolution, our uprising started. So this is still the middle of the night. You know, his scouts go out to some of the local farms and come back, and Brown is like, "Where's all the slaves?" And they're like, "Well, they didn't want to join the fight." He's like, "What do you mean? We're here to free them." He's like, "Well, yeah, they want to be free, but they're scared. They don't want to get into a big fight and get killed." And Brown's like, "Well, how are we going to start this whole uprising without a slave army?" And his men are like, "Well, I don't know." And again, Brown's lack of military training here becomes painfully obvious. His whole plan begins to unravel. He doesn't know what his next move is. He has no contingency plan, and he's just kind of in limbo at this point. Well, it's of little consequence because by the time Brown is realizing this plan is coming unraveled, local people have already alerted the authorities, and U.S. troops are on their way to deal with Brown. So the Virginia state government dispatches some militia troops called up to serve, or they've been federalized troops. So this is U.S. Army troops here coming to arrest Brown and his men. Now this small is about a company or battalion-sized element of U.S. troops here, led by a young colonel named Robert E. Lee. You might have heard of him. Robert E. Lee, of course, will go on to be the most prominent general in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. At this point, though, Robert E. Lee is just a colonel in the Virginia militia, and he's in charge of these U.S. troops who've come to deal with John Brown. And of course, here we see the artist illustration here, the firehouse where Brown and his men were holed up, and of course our U.S. Army troops here to stop Brown's attempted slave uprising. Well, given Brown's disorganization and lack of a plan, this is over very quickly. The U.S. troops wounded Brown, they killed several of his men, and the rest were captured. So this is over very quickly. This whole thing, start to finish, doesn't even last 24 hours. So Brown's whole big plan of liberating all these slaves and starting a massive uprising that'll sweep the South, tearing down the institution of slavery, it never happens. The whole thing is over within a day. So start to finish, less than 24 hours. And it's a complete failure. Brown and his men completely failed to accomplish their objective here. However, that doesn't mean that this is not going to have a big impact. Despite the fact that Brown never succeeded in his plan, not one single slave was liberated, not one single slave was armed, no uprising ever took place as a result of this. People in the South are going to look at this event, this John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, and they're going to point to this and they're going to say, "See there, we told you that something like this was going to happen." Basically, this John Brown's raid is the Southerners' worst nightmare potentially coming true. For years, Southerners have been afraid that this abolitionist movement was going to set off some kind of a slave uprising, or the slaves themselves would rise up inspired by the abolitionist movement, and it would start a massive slave rebellion throughout the South. that never happened. I mean, there were slave uprisings from time to time in the South, but they were all very small scale. Most of them ended within a day or so. But this fear of a massive slave uprising, was what prompted all the slave codes and these restrictions, and the brutality of slavery was largely inspired by this fear of potential slave uprising. When John Brown and his group raid Harper's Ferry, Southerners look at this and they're like, "This is it. This is what we've been talking about all these years. You know, everybody said we were crazy, but here's the evidence. Here's the proof that Northern abolitionists are actively trying to incite a massive uprising here in the South." And John Brown is the evidence of that. And of course, John Brown, he denies nothing. When he's questioned at his trial, he said, "Yeah, I was trying to start a slave uprising, and if I had the opportunity, I'd do it again." You know, he comes right out and says that it was his intention to start a massive slave uprising. Of course, the press are covering his trial, and Southerners are watching this, and they're like, "This is it. This is exactly what we've been talking about all these years, and nobody believed us." So Southerners are completely outraged at this. Their minds are made up. You know, in the minds of most Southerners, there is no turning back from this. They say that, okay, clearly we were right. Northerners, and these abolitionists especially, they're not going to rest until they completely destroy our way of life. Our only hope of preserving our way of life now is to secede from the Union. So what happens is that Southern state legislatures, they start making plans. They start moving forward on secession. They start stockpiling weapons and ammunition. They start building their own arsenals separate from the federal arsenals. Because keep in mind, there's arsenals in every state, but they all belong to the federal government. Southern states now start building their own arsenals separate from the federal arsenal network. They start coordinating their activities with each other. So all the southern state governments are now coordinating their activities, making preparations for a war that they believe is inevitable now. And keep in mind, this is 1859, so the Civil War is only about a year or so away. So Southerners now, this John Brown's raid, this is the last straw for them. They're like, okay, we are done. We are going to go ahead and assume that war is coming, and we're just going to start preparing for it. Because they clearly, the North is not going to rest until our life has been destroyed down here. So Brown will be executed in December of 1859 after his trial. Of course, he pled guilty to everything. He made no apologies whatsoever for his actions. And of course, his trial was very swift, and the jury sentence was pretty unanimous. You know, they charged him with treason, conspiracy, and murder. And of course, he's found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. His last words, as they marched him up the gallows to be hung or to be hanged, his last words were, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." And this is kind of morbid and it's kind of stark here, but there's some foreshadowing in Brown's words. You know, while no one has mentioned the prospect of civil war out loud at this point, a lot of people hear Brown's words and they're like, you know what, he's probably right. You know, if this situation was going to be resolved peaceably and politically, it probably would have happened by now. The fact that this debate has just gotten worse and worse over the years, and now this John Brown's raid and Southerners preparing for secession, a lot of people are thinking it. They're not really saying it out loud right now because I don't think anybody really wants to admit failure in this situation. But a lot of people are thinking that Brown is right, that this is not going to end except with bloodshed. And when we take our last look at Brown here in this illustration, it really kind of places Brown in his proper context. Of course, Southerners condemned Brown as a villain, a terrorist. Northerners, especially among the abolitionist community, they hailed Brown as a hero. They sung songs of tribute. In fact, they saw him as a martyr for the cause. They saw him as a hero. In fact, a lot of people in the North championed Brown as a hero. They said, we need more John Browns in this country, people who are willing to actively take this fight to the enemy. And regardless of how you look at Brown, whether he's a villain or whether he's a hero, we cannot deny the role that Brown plays in this story. He does play a very important role. We could debate hero versus villain for years, but the role that he plays in this story is important because he's a catalyst. And a catalyst basically is something that speeds up a process. Usually it refers to chemical reactions, but Brown is a catalyst here in this debate over slavery, this issue that is dividing the nation into two separate camps. Brown is a catalyst in this process. He's speeding up this process. His actions here at Harper's Ferry, it just further accelerates an already deteriorating relationship between North and South. And this artist, of course, this painting was done years after the Civil War in an attempt to try and illustrate Brown's role in the story. And obviously Brown was never 12 feet tall. This is obviously the artist is trying to make a point here about how influential Brown was. So here Brown is at the center of this whole mess, and everything in this picture suggests chaos and destruction. The tornado on the plains here, the burning horizon, people making some kind of an exodus here. Of course, dead soldiers laying at Brown's feet, Southerners and Northerners taking up arms against each other, slaves caught in the middle, and so on and so forth. All these chaotic and destructive images that this artist has included in this picture, and Brown is right at the center of all of it. Rifle in one hand, Bible in the other hand, and this crazed look on his face of a madman. All of this suggests that Brown has played an important role in this story, in that he has taken a situation that was already very tenuous and fragile and on the brink of falling apart, and he just pushed the nation right over the edge here. So Brown, this one man and his radical beliefs, has managed to speed up this process by which the nation is moving towards civil war. We don't want to be so careless as to suggest that Brown himself caused the Civil War. These issues were in place long before anyone ever heard of John Brown. But John Brown is going to play an important role in speeding up this animosity between North and South, which will eventually lead to the Civil War here in the next year or so. When we come back in the next session, that's where we're going to pick it up with the election of 1860, in which Abraham Lincoln will be elected President of the United States, and we'll talk about how that is kind of the final ending to the nation on the eve of the Civil War. So that's where we'll pick it up next time. We'll talk about the election of 1860 and the secession of the Southern states.